Welcome to the 13th edition of the Zee Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa at Charbagh. Before we begin, could I please request the audience to occupy the front rows first? There are quite a few chairs that could be used. We're delighted to introduce session 99, Low. Following the death of his wife, Dominic Ulis escapes to Bombay in search of oblivion and a dangerous new drug, Meow Meow. So begins a glorious weekend of misadventure as he tours the teeming, kaleidoscopic city from its sleek eries of high capital to the piss-stained streets, encountering a cast with their own stories to tell, but none of whom Ulis, his faculties ever distorted, is quite sure he can trust. Heady, heartbroken, and heartfelt, Low is a blazing joyride through the dark lands of grief towards obliteration and perhaps epiphany. Please join me in welcoming the man of the hour, Jeet Thayil, the multi-talented journalist, author, and musician, who's going to be in conversation with the literary and culture editor of Open magazine, Nandini Nair. To launch Jeet Thayil's book, Low, we have with us the founder of the literary agency DGA, David Godwin, who's handled a wide range of writers and represents the most popular names in the literary world. Let's welcome them on stage with a huge round of applause.
Well, welcome everybody. It falls on me to unveil this book. I've known Jeet for probably 10 or 12 years, and this is the third book I'm going to say we've done together. It's been just published in England to really rapturous reviews. Am I going to, have you got your piece? I'm going to read a little bit from the FT review. Better to hear it here than me saying it. Intoxication is difficult to write about with clarity and without self-indulgence. Only a few writers succeed in making hallucinatory reveries or amphetamine-fueled adventures engaging for the reader. But there are glorious exceptions in modern fiction, such as the American Dennis Johnson and the Chilean Robert Bolaño. And after 3 novels in which drugs, in which drugs feature, the last bit, hold on. It's worth waiting for. After 3 novels in which drugs feature heavily, the Indian writer Jeet is another, which is an exceptional compliment to the book. I will now unveil the book.
I request Jeet sir and Nandini ma'am to also join him.
I'm going to start off talking not about the book immediately because it's a launch and I would encourage you all to go read it. I think it's absolutely a riveting read, but also it's a difficult read. And I would say difficult because I think it's something to do with the heart of the matter, which is grief. And my first question to Jeet is essentially the line that I picked up from the book, and which is, I think, the line that is the crux of the book, and that is, regret is the river of the world. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that line and how that, in a way, encapsulates the novel.
I think, I mean, I'd like to say it is a book about grief, but I wanted to write a funny book about grief, that doesn't kind of mind that in an easy way, because very often my favorite kinds of books are books where you laugh and cry on the same page. So this is a grief-stricken book, but it's also full of black comedy. So if you like your comedy black, I think you will like this book. About the river of the world, grief and misery. I think this might be truer now than it's ever been. And I don't think it even needs an explanation. It's apparent all around us.
This book is, of course, a lot about the main character's various drug trips and his hallucinatory journeys over one weekend in Bombay. And just to sort of tell you, he's a character who's carrying his wife's ashes in a box, and he reaches Bombay, like a review said, without even a pair of underwear. So it's him in this box in a plane and then reaching a city and looking for a place to immerse his wife's ashes because there is a shortage of clean water in Delhi. And he's a character searching for the most basics of thing, which is clean water. So I want to ask you a little bit about how do you manage to write about his tripping so well?
Gee, I don't know. I guess I did some investigative first-hand research into that particular topic over a couple of decades. Maybe too much research. It might be slightly top-heavy in that sense. But about, excuse me, finding, excuse me, bad throat. About finding clean water, he never does find any clean water, not even in Bombay. So, in the Hindu tradition, it's the idea is that when you cremate a person, the ashes go into flowing water, clean and flowing water. And I think that might be very difficult to do in the India of today. In Delhi, it's impossible. The Yamuna in Delhi is just really like a sewage canal. And in Bombay, too, it's almost impossible. And eventually, the character in the novel makes a kind of a compromise, I suppose.
Your book, the previous one, the novel Chocolate Saints, was your big book. And this, in a way, came out just 2 years later. What was the process of writing this book, in a way? Is this something that you've actually been working on for many years, or was it a book? Because you call Chocolate Saints your best novel ever. Right. So what does a novelist do once he's written his best?
Saints took 6 years to write. And I think I was just being much too much of a perfectionist and trying to make every sentence flawless. And I just think there's no excuse to spend 6 years on a book. I think at this late stage in my life, I finally figured out how to write novels, and that is fast. You just do it and don't get too anxious about it, and just tell your story and try and bring some pleasure to the reader. And this one Chocolate Saints took 6 years. This took 8 months. And the next one took 9 months. So I think I'm finally cracking the code.
Are you getting better and faster, or just faster?
Maybe worse and faster.
I want to ask you about, you like describing politicians, and I think you like describing Trump especially in some parts. Why does he lend himself to literature so easily?
If you had invented a character, if as a novelist you had invented a character like Trump 10 or 15 years ago, there would be reviewers and critics all over the world saying, this is absolutely unbelievable. How over the top is this character? He can barely speak English. He talks like a mobster. If you as someone recently did, if you transcribe his speeches and break it up into unequal lines, it reads like the poetry of somebody demented. And there is a book called The Beautiful Poetry of Donald J. Trump, which does exactly that. And the thing is, here is this guy who's actually, you know, on our screens every day. It's really as if it really makes you think that fiction cannot compete with real life in some cases, you know.
There's a lot that's happening in India as well that lends itself well to fiction in the sense of how unbelievable it seems to be. And I think those are also issues that you do touch upon. And I think there is a part in your novel as well about how people in past seem to be scared of women students and poets.
Yeah.
And why do you think these are the three forces which, according to them, are dangerous?
Because the women students and poets tend to think for themselves and cannot be bought very often, and very often cannot be intimidated, and those are the people that our current regime does not appreciate, I think.
This is, of course, a very Bombay book, and you always call it Bombay throughout. And you also talk about the irredeemable ugliness of the city. What is your own connection with the metropolis?
It's a love-hate connection. I never miss the city until I arrive there and get off the plane, and you get that smell, which is a smell of sewage and roses, or kind of incense and the gutter kind of mixed together. And then I miss it when I'm there. And I'm often quite happy to leave, you know. But I spent a lot of my formative years in Bombay. And the poets I knew, the artists I knew at that time during my 20s and 30s, I think had a kind of a defining effect on me. So it's a kind of residual nostalgia / remorse for a city.
Since you mentioned the poets of Bombay, I think we need to ask you about Dom Moraes, and I think you pay tribute to him in your last one and even in this book, the character's first name. So maybe we could tell the audience a bit about why he is such an important figure for you.
Dom Moraes was one of the poets of Bombay who kind of defined what modern Indian poetry is. And he spent most of his time in Bombay, in Colaba. He was in Oxford as a younger man, became very famous in Oxford when he was about 18 or 19, and in London because he won a prize at a very young age. And it kind of destroyed him in terms of poetry because it kind of ended his poetic career. The money and the fame and the alcohol kind of stopped the poetry for about 18 years, during which he only wrote prose. But the thing about Dom was he was, unlike many of the poets of that time, he was very generous with younger poets, with young writers. He, in fact, was generous to a fault in every way, in terms of introducing young poets to other people, and in terms of giving you a drink or buying you a meal if you didn't have the money.
Like in Chocolate Saints, and I think in this book as well, sort of fact and fiction dance in and out of each other's arms in your prose. In this novel, especially since it was a story very close to home and close to your heart, what was the challenge of writing something like that? Like when about sort of fictionalizing fact? I
had a really good time, actually. Every time I would see something about the climate, for example, about what's happening on the planet, I would make a note. Every time I read a new piece of absurdity by our prime minister or the American president, I would try and incorporate that. So it became very kind of as if it was written in real time. And because it's over 2 days, the entire length of the book, it was able to kind of give you a sense of real time and how quickly things happen. And kind of, I just found a way to drag those things into the narrative. And I think in a way that makes the pace of the book faster, and I think gives some kind of pleasure, I hope, to the reader in terms of how quickly things happen.
Can I ask you a question about that? You wrote a famous sequence of poems some years ago about the same topic. What is the relationship between this and those poems? Just out of pure interest.
Thank you. I think that was the first time I tried to write about grief, really, and it was a sequence called Premonition, which actually did use a lot of real life. And of course, you know, in fact, poetry fictionalizes real life more than fiction does in some ways, because what poets do is they take real life and then they put it into beautiful language. And there's nothing beautiful about many of the things, you know, that poets are talking about, but these are beautiful lies, really. That's what poets do. We specialize in beautiful lies. And it's a way actually of disguising something, really, and of kind of putting a mask on yourself as the author of those poems or that piece of fiction. But I hope to be done with that subject with this book.
You have a wonderful description of grief when someone, I think, at a party mentions how there are 5 stages. And the main character says that that's a model and that's untrue. That's why it's a model. And I think you talk about what exactly grief is. Can we read out that passage, or would you want to discuss that? Should we read it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is about the Kubler-Ross model, which says that there are 5 stages of grief, and it ends with acceptance. And I think anybody who's experienced grief knows that this is absolute horse twaddle. There are no stages. Everything bleeds into everything else. The model had nothing to do with the living, who would spend the rest of their lives trying to process a single commonplace event, for whom the notion of stages did not exist, for whom there was no timeline, no demarcation, no 5 easy movements ending in some kind of Zen acceptance and forgiveness. No stages, but an infinite spectrum, 1,000 adjustments without an end in sight. Nothing here was linear or chronological. There was no beginning and no end. You moved back and forth like a time tourist, at sea without a compass, nothing above you but the tearful glimmer of the stars. Grief, like time, is circular.
Don't worry. I think climate change is something that we have spoken about before, and you mentioned how Amitav Ghosh, for example, felt that it wasn't addressed sufficiently in the fiction of today. And I think one of the wonderful things about this novel is that it brings it in so subtly. It's not a climate change novel, but I don't think any novel should be, but it's just about what's happening around the world. And like you said, you were sort of taking notes while writing this, taking notes about what was happening around. So could you tell us a little bit about that, about the need to address this issue?
Amitav Ghosh wrote a really important book called The Great Derangement, which appeared about 2 years ago, in which he made a challenge to novelists. And the point was, he said 20 or 30 years from now, when people read your novels, if you don't mention what's happening to the planet, and if you don't talk about climate, they're going to read your books and say, was this person deaf, dumb, insensate? So it really is a kind of a challenge to novelists. And I took it seriously and made it kind of like a running thread through the book. And I didn't want, again, to make it heavy-handed. So it's woven in, I hope, in a creative and pleasurable way.
I think there are many. I think I would like to ask you, when you read this novel, people have, for example, mentioned how many of his characters represent something. Like he said, everything is he has a very light hand when dealing with topical issues. What would you say about that?
First of all, did you read the novel?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I remember it. Well, I read all your novels. I read more than your novels too, because when this is the third, essentially the third part, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So the first, I remember. Well, there was a huge manuscript. Do you remember all that? And there was.
It was 1,000 pages.
It was normal, and it's this kind of part. So, Narcopolis came out of that. And I remember actually here when it won the prize. Do you remember? Yeah. And it was dark, and we were on the front lawns. And the beginning of the Narcopolis is really wonderful. It is a man telling you a story. And the book opens with the account of this man lighting a candle. And we sat there in the front lawns in the dark. And all the lights went out, and you lit a candle and just read from the book, beginning of the book. And it was just one of the most marvelous moments I'd ever witnessed. So, then Chocolate Saints, an incredible book, I think. This is very different, I think, much simpler, clearer. But I would say I've read another one since then, which is probably the best of them all, I think. But that's to come in a year or so. And that's not set here. There are no drugs in it. It's the most surprising novel you'd ever imagine this man writing. Isn't that right?
I think so.
So you have to tell them what it is now, I think. Or
Well,
maybe not.
I think it's true to say that Low is the final installment of a trilogy, which is kind of set in Bombay and deals with drugs, with poets, with artists, with a bohemian kind of subset. And the final installment is set in modern times right now. And I think at this point I'm done with that world. And it started really with the manuscript David was talking about, 1,000-page baggy monster of a novel that I'm very glad wasn't published in that state. I cut Narcopolis out of that, kind of a 250-page, 280-page book out of that, and then redid the rest of it into Chocolate Saints, and then Low just kind of happened over the space of 8 or 9 months. And it really, because there are characters who recur through the 3 books. The narrator of Narcopolis is the narrator of Low. A character who occurs in Narcopolis for the first chapter, Chocolate Saints belongs to that character. It's all about his life. So it's all kind of interconnected. There are references and allusions that occur throughout those 3 novels. The next one, which I've just sent to David, is as much of a departure as departures can be. It's a retelling of the New Testament through the eyes of the women who have been erased from the story. So each chapter belongs to a female character who has either been suppressed or erased from the different books that make up the New Testament, because all those stories were told by men. So, yeah, there are absolutely no drugs in it at all, except there's a fair amount of wine, though.
And the religious drug, I suppose, is there too.
The opium of the masses, yeah.
I think you've also mentioned how you will not go back to writing poetry. Why is that?
You know, I wrote 5 books of poems, and at one time when I didn't have the space or the mental resources to be a full-time writer, to write every day, all I could manage were poems because, as the poets in the audience know, a poem happens in a burst. You might edit it, rework it, but the fun of it is that burst of original inspiration. It happens very quickly, and you might rework it for months, but that one thing is fast, and you don't need space, you don't need money, you don't need time even to be able to do it. A novel is a whole other thing. You do need a kind of space, a protected space. You need a lot of time. You need to be able to think about it every day and to work on the same story every day for an extended period of time. And to do that, you need the gift of time and money, which I never had in my 20s and teens and 30s. I was a working journalist. I had a drug habit to support, you know, which is more expensive than children, actually. And that's no longer the case, and I was able to just expand, I guess, into prose.
I think it's actually very rare that good poets write good novels. If you, I mean, Hardy, maybe, I think, but literally, very hard to think of people.
Dennis Johnson.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful poet, wonderful novelist. Naipaul started as a failed poet.
Well, that figures. That proves my point, I think.
That's true.
Would you want Jeet to go back to poetry or to write another collection of poetry?
I'd
As a
have to
literary agent, would that be your...
I'd have to go back to drugs as well in that case.
That's okay. He does what he wants. My role is totally insignificant of this. And if I had a view, I'm not sure. Well, I don't have a view.
Would you want to do another reading? The climate change one? Sure. That's fine. We're just going to... no, this is just a normal.
Yeah, that's the next.
So this is the character speaking. It's a monologue, and it's about the metropolis, and I find it just a very interesting read. And Jeet said he would read it for us, so here we go.
The protagonist of the novel bumps into some street junkies in Bombay late at night, and he sits with them and does smoke some heroin. And at one point, one of these guys asks him in Hindi what he thought of Bombay's monsoons. And this is his reply. I find it hard to believe that people live here. It's uninhabitable for most of the year, but the monsoons are murderous. The entire city flooded with filth, said Ullis, looking up at the clear night sky, alert to augury and fray. It's unlivable, yet people live here. It's true of everywhere, true and getting truer as the years pass. You can see it if you look for it. First, the water rises slowly, so slowly it's imperceptible, but you know it's higher than it was. Excuse me. You know it's higher than it was last year. It's higher, and you have to raise your house. You raise your house, and then you raise it again. Now the water comes suddenly. Huge water, huge lakes, great rivers where it has always been dry. Flash floods in places that have never flooded before. Then the water doesn't come at all. It dries the earth, cracks it open. There are cracks where there was moisture, a new desert, and people become water refugees. They take their animals and move to the cities, but the cities can't handle the influx. The riots begin, the killings, the long struggle, tribes forming and reforming, everybody living for the day, for the next few hours. It's already happening. It's already crazy that we live the way we live. Look at the huge fissures in the land and in the water. Think about earthquakes, entire towns flattened overnight or washed away overnight, your house shredding around you, your street washed away, your car floating upside down among the trees. The permafrost, thawing faster than anybody imagined, abruptly thawing over vast tracts of the Arctic and the billions of tons of carbon that's locked into it, waiting to be released into the atmosphere to make everything hotter, more heat, more water, more displacement. We say, how can this be? Yet we endure. Year after year we endure. It's a natural calamity, we say. The hand of God is upon us, but we take pride in our resilience. We shall overcome. We'll bounce back, but it's happening more often, and it gets worse every time. And what do you do afterwards? Do you go back to the town or neighborhood or village that has washed away or dried up? Do you try and reconstruct your life? How do you do it when the old world is gone? How do you live through the next catastrophe? How do you persist? How do you rebuild knowing it will happen again? You search the sky for clues, listen to the birds and the dogs for a warning, and you pick up and move on, go somewhere new to start again. Why do you do it? There's nowhere to go, and everywhere is the same. Thank you very much.
I think that's just a lovely last line for that passage, because it kind of tells us how the climate emergency is inescapable. The rich can delude themselves that they will be safe, and the poor will be the most vulnerable, but finally there is nowhere to go. We could change gears a little bit, and I will do a rapid fire round with Jeet. And then we will end with a Q&A and a reading. So the Q&A will be very short because we don't have much time. But okay, so this is...
Is that all we have?
Oh, so then should we just do the reading?
I think so.
Okay. So I think we're going to then just do the reading since we're out of time.
This is a character in the novel, a woman who's in a hotel room and she's watching television. She took a sip of whiskey and wondered why she watched television in the first place. Addicted. She was addicted to the stoppage of linear time. When she allowed herself to be sucked into the screen, time dissolved into concept. It was like entering a new reality. The politicians and hucksters peddling slime and poison, the men in khaki and saffron who defended the indefensible, who protected the murderers acting in the name of the cow, who protected the rapists and the bullies. She could not look away. She watched as the scene switched to footage of the nation's bearded prime minister espousing yoga as a means to world peace. To demonstrate the truth of his assertion, he enacted a ridiculously simple asana that a novice could accomplish by stretching his arms above his head. Now he was blocking his nostril with a forefinger to demonstrate the correct breathing technique for the modern yogi. What earthly connection was there between him and the vast nation he so maliciously governed? The very next piece of breaking news was an old man being beaten up by a gang of teenage hoodlums for the crime of belonging to a religious minority. So here was the connection between the rulers and the ruled, between the tailored, barbered overlords and their unwashed foot soldiers. A plague of blood-gorged bloodsuckers battening on fear, a horde of upright leeches scouring the starving nation. Encased in fat, which they wore like armor, they divided the poor and mocked their poverty. They didn't worry about being held accountable for their crimes. Anything could be spun into a story about nationalism and its opposite. Equality was propaganda, and reason was conspiracy, and compassion a sign of weakness. What intoxicated them was power, the habit-forming rush of it, the way the masses parted and felt to genuflect in their presence. What drove them was sex, the ease of it, how easily it could be bought or coerced, for they were the new statesmen of India, all of them men, foul-mouthed and unlettered, squatting to eat, squatting to shit, squatting to watch porn in the Houses of Parliament, stopping their convoys to piss squatting on the road, instigating, improvising, spreading. And what were they spreading? Exactly this: murder and the incitement to murder. The message was pounded home in the words they used and the words between the words. No image was too trite, no metaphor too labored, no gesture too gross. This was their great accomplishment. The way they hefted their testicles for reassurance that their genitals were intact. The way they touched themselves to make certain they were still men. But they were not men. They were blood-black humanoids with a taste for terror and sex, at their happiest when they were together, men without women, laughing, eating, yawning, cleaning their plates with their fat fingers, cow talk, their preferred mode of communication, accomplished with much chewing of the cud, with much lowing and bellowing, with the endless proprietorial dropping of dung. She watched with fascination and gratitude as the procession of the pitiless passed before her. Fascination because that was the homage paid to power by the powerless. Was it not a privilege that she was even allowed to watch their craven enactments of persecution and revenge? And gratitude was due to the good Lord for alcohol, because there was no other way to preserve one's sanity in the face of extreme yogic oppression. Television, she couldn't look away. Thank you very much.
We wish to thank Jeet Thayil, Nandini Nair and David Godwin for the very enriching session. Do note that Jeet Thayil will be available to sign his books, and also he'll be available for interaction at the book signing desk, which is right in front, right at the entrance of Charbagh. So you can go grab a copy and get it signed. We also appreciate if you could line up so it's more systematic. Thank you so much. The next session at Charbagh is session 103, Books to Digital. It'll begin shortly. I request the audience to kindly occupy the front rows first and to also turn their phones on silent mode. Thank you.